They say trust is the foundation of marriage. But what happens when that foundation crumbles in the most public way imaginable? What happens when the man you thought you knew completely becomes a stranger in death? This is my story about discovering that everything I believed about my life was a carefully constructed lie, and how I fought to reclaim not just my dignity, but my very identity. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and until 3 months ago, I thought I had it all figured out. I was living what most people would call the American dream in our cozy Beaverton home, married to David Mitchell, the love of my life and successful owner of Mitchell & Associates marketing firm. We had built something beautiful together over 12 years of marriage. David was everything I had ever wanted in a partner: ambitious, caring, and devoted to our life together. At least, that's what I believed. I met David when I was 28, working as a graphic designer for a small firm downtown Portland. He walked into our office one Tuesday morning, confident and charming, looking for someone to redesign his company's branding. The moment our eyes met, I felt something shift inside me. He had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room, like your thoughts and opinions mattered more than anything else in the world. By the end of that first meeting, he had asked me to dinner, and by the end of our first date, I knew I was going to marry him. Our courtship was like something out of a romantic movie. David would surprise me with weekend trips to the Oregon coast, long walks through the Japanese garden, and intimate dinners at small restaurants tucked away in the Pearl District. He listened when I talked about my dreams of one day opening my own design studio, and he encouraged me when I doubted myself. When he proposed on a misty morning at Multnomah Falls, with the waterfall cascading behind us, I said yes without hesitation. I thought I was the luckiest woman alive. The early years of our marriage were everything I had dreamed they would be. David's business was growing steadily, and we bought our first house together, a charming craftsman-style home with a garden that I spent weekends tending. I eventually left my job to help David with his marketing firm, handling the creative side while he focused on client relationships and business development. We made a perfect team, or so I thought. We talked about starting a family, traveling the world, growing old together on our front porch. The future seemed bright and full of possibility. David was the kind of husband who remembered anniversaries, who brought me coffee in bed on Sunday mornings, who would call me in the middle of his workday just to tell me he loved me. He was present for every birthday, every holiday, every moment that mattered. When my father passed away 4 years ago, David was my rock, holding me through the grief and helping me navigate the difficult decisions that came with loss. When I struggled with infertility, and the doctors told us that having children might be more difficult than we had hoped, David assured me that our life together was complete, with or without kids. He seemed perfect, and I felt grateful every day to be his wife. But looking back now, I can see the signs that I missed. The business trips that seemed to happen more frequently, always to cities just a few hours away. The phone calls he would take outside, claiming they were sensitive client matters. The way he sometimes seemed distracted during dinner, like his mind was somewhere else entirely. The credit card statements that occasionally had charges I didn't recognize, though David always had reasonable explanations. A dinner with a potential client, a hotel upgrade, a gift for a business partner's retirement. I trusted him completely, so I never questioned these small inconsistencies. David was a creature of habit in most ways. He drank his coffee black, read the newspaper every morning before work, and always parked on the same side of the garage. He preferred routine and predictability, which made his occasional spontaneous business trips seem even more out of character. But he would explain them as opportunities he couldn't pass up, chances to expand the business and secure our future. I supported him because that's what partners do. They trust each other, they build each other up, and they work toward common goals. The morning of February 14th, Valentine's Day, started like any other. David kissed me goodbye before heading to what he said was an important client meeting in Salem. He promised to be back by dinner so we could celebrate properly, and he left a beautiful bouquet of roses on the kitchen counter with a note that said, "To my one and only love, thank you for making every day feel like Valentine's Day." I spent the day planning a special dinner, picking out the perfect wine, and setting the table with our good china. I was excited to surprise him with the vacation I had secretly booked to Hawaii for our upcoming anniversary. The phone call came at 6:37 in the evening. I remember the exact time because I was checking my watch, wondering why David was running late. The voice on the other end was professional but gentle, a nurse from Salem Hospital explaining that my husband had suffered a massive heart attack during his meeting and had been rushed to the emergency room. By the time the ambulance arrived, it was too late. David Mitchell, my husband of 12 years, the man I thought I would grow old with, was gone at the age of 45. The world stopped moving. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what I was hearing. This had to be a mistake. David was healthy, active, young. We had just talked about joining a gym together, planning hiking trips for the spring. Heart attacks happen to other people, older people, people who didn't take care of themselves. Not David. Not my David. The nurse was patient with my questions, my demands for more information, my insistence that there had to be some error. But the details were all correct. His name, his age, his identification. It was real, and my entire world had just collapsed. The drive to Salem was a blur of tears and disbelief. I called my sister Rachel, who lived in Seattle, and she immediately got in her car to drive down. I called David's business partner, Steve, who was as shocked as I was. I called our closest friends, each conversation feeling surreal, like I was talking about someone else's life. The words, "David is dead," felt foreign coming out of my mouth, like I was speaking a language I didn't understand. At the hospital, the reality hit me with crushing force. They led me to a small, sterile room where David lay still and peaceful, looking like he was simply sleeping. I held his hand, still warm, and whispered all the things I wished I had said that morning. I told him about the Hawaii trip, about how much I loved him, about how sorry I was that we never got to have the family we dreamed about. I stayed with him for hours, unable to accept that this was goodbye. The next few days passed in a haze of funeral arrangements, insurance calls, and the overwhelming generosity of friends and family. David's clients sent flowers and condolences, praising him as a brilliant businessman and a man of integrity. Our neighbors brought casseroles and offered to help with anything I needed. The house filled with people who loved David, sharing stories and memories that should have brought me comfort. Instead, they only emphasized how much I had lost, how empty my future now seemed. Planning David's funeral felt like an impossible task. How do you summarize a life? Choose the right flowers. Pick music that captures the essence of someone you loved so deeply. I decided on a service at Rose City Cemetery, where David's parents were buried, followed by a reception at the Heathman Hotel downtown. David had always loved that hotel, and we had celebrated several anniversaries there. It seemed fitting to honor him in a place that held happy memories for us. The morning of the funeral, I woke up in our empty house and for a moment forgot that David was gone. I reached for him across the bed before the reality crashed over me again. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I put on the black dress David had complimented me in just a few months earlier. The one he said made my eyes look beautiful, even when I was sad. I wanted to look strong for him, to honor his memory with dignity and grace. I had no idea that this day would destroy not just my grief, but my entire understanding of who my husband really was. The cemetery was packed with people who had known and loved David. Business associates, college friends, neighbors, family members who had traveled from across the country to pay their respects. I stood at the front, accepting hugs and condolences, trying to be the gracious widow that everyone expected me to be. The service was beautiful, with eulogies that painted David as the man I thought I knew. Loving, successful, devoted to his family and friends. I felt proud of the life we had built, together, even as my heart was breaking. As the ceremony concluded and people began to move toward their cars for the drive to the reception, I noticed a woman standing apart from the crowd. She was about my age, with long dark hair and striking features, wearing a black dress that looked expensive. Next to her stood a teenage girl who bore an unmistakable resemblance to David. The same dark eyes, the same strong jawline, the same way of standing with one shoulder slightly higher than the other. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at them, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The woman was crying, but not the polite, respectful tears of a business acquaintance or distant friend. These were the deep, wrenching sobs of someone who had lost everything. The teenager had her arm around the woman's shoulders, comforting her with the practiced ease of someone who had done this before. They stood there for a long moment, watching as David's casket was lowered into the ground, and then they turned to leave. Something inside me compelled me to follow them. I told my sister I would meet her at the reception and walked quickly across the cemetery grounds, trying to catch up without seeming obvious. As I got closer, I could hear their conversation, and what I heard made my blood run cold. "I can't believe he's really gone, Mom," the teenager was saying, her voice thick with emotion. "What are we going to do now?" "I don't know, Emma," the woman replied, her voice breaking. "I just don't know. He promised he would take care of us. That we would always be his priority. Now what? That woman gets everything, and we get nothing." I stopped walking, feeling like I had been punched in the stomach. That woman. They were talking about me. But how did they know about me, and more importantly, why did this teenager call David's death a personal loss? Who were these people? And what was their connection to my husband? "He said he was going to leave her," the woman continued, not knowing I was close enough to hear every word. "He said after their anniversary this year, he was finally going to tell her about us, and we could be a real family. Now she gets the house, the business, everything that should have been ours." The world tilted on its axis. Leave me? Tell me about them? A real family? I felt like I was listening to someone describe a stranger's life, not my own. David had never mentioned wanting to leave me. We had been happy, or at least I thought we had been. We were planning vacations, talking about the future, living like people who intended to grow old together. What did this woman mean? "Maybe we should talk to her," the teenager suggested. "Maybe she doesn't know about us. Dad always said she was a good person, that she would understand if she knew the truth." Absolutely not," the woman snapped. "David made me promise to never contact her unless something happened to him. He said it would destroy her, and she didn't deserve that. But now he's gone, and his promises don't matter anymore. I have to think about you, about our future." I stood frozen behind a large oak tree, trying to process what I was hearing. David had another family, a woman he had promised to leave me for, and a daughter who called him Dad. How was this possible? How had I lived with this man for 12 years and never known? How had he managed to maintain two separate lives, two separate families, two separate promises of forever? The woman and the girl walked toward a silver sedan parked at the edge of the cemetery. As they got into the car, I caught a glimpse of the woman's profile, and something clicked into place. I had seen her before, not in person but in a photograph on David's phone. When I had asked about it months ago, he had said she was a client, someone whose marketing campaign had been particularly successful. He had seemed proud of the work they had done together, and I had been happy that his business was thriving. Now I realized that she wasn't just a client. She was the other woman, the other life, the other half of David's carefully constructed lie. I stood in that cemetery for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, watching their car disappear down the winding road. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. How long had this been going on? Did other people know? Was I the only one who had been living in complete ignorance? The funeral reception suddenly felt impossible to face. How could I stand there accepting condolences and sharing memories when everything I thought I knew about my husband was a lie? But I had no choice. People were expecting me, counting on me to be strong and gracious in my grief. I drove to the Heathman Hotel in a daze, going through the motions of thanking people for coming, accepting their stories about David's kindness and generosity. Every word felt like a knife in my heart. They were praising a man who had betrayed me in the most fundamental way possible, a man who had been living a double life while I planned our future together. My sister Rachel noticed something was wrong. Immediately, she pulled me aside during the reception and asked if I was okay, if the day had been too much. I wanted to tell her everything, to break down and confess that my entire marriage had been a sham, but I couldn't find the words. How? Do you explain that the man everyone is eulogizing as a devoted husband was planning to leave you for another woman? How do you admit that you were so naive, so trusting, that you never suspected your husband had a whole other family? Instead, I told Rachel I was just tired and overwhelmed, which was true enough. She stayed close to me for the rest of the reception, making sure I ate something and handling conversations when I felt too emotionally drained to respond. The kindness of friends and family should have been comforting, but instead, it felt like salt in an open wound. They were grieving the David they thought they knew, while I was grieving not just my husband, but my entire understanding of my own life. As the reception wound down and people began to leave, I found myself alone in the hotel bathroom, staring at my reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at me seemed like a stranger. How had I been so blind? How had I missed the signs that now seemed so obvious? The business trips, the phone calls, the moments when David seemed distant or distracted. I had attributed all of it to the normal stresses of running a business and maintaining a marriage. I had never imagined that he was maintaining two marriages, two families, two completely separate lives. The drive home to our empty house felt longer than usual. Everything looked the same as when I had left that morning, but nothing felt the same. The roses David had left for Valentine's Day were still on the kitchen counter, now wilted and brown. The note about being his one and only love felt like a cruel joke. How many women had received similar notes from my husband? How many promises had he made that he never intended to keep? I walked through our house like a ghost, seeing it with new eyes. The master bedroom where we had slept together every night for 12 years. Had he ever lain awake thinking about her? The kitchen where we had cooked dinner together, talking about our days and planning our weekends? Had he been thinking about his other family during those conversations? The living room where we had spent countless evenings watching movies and dreaming about the future. What future had he been dreaming about? That night, I did something I had never done in all our years together. I went through David's personal belongings, looking for evidence of the life I now knew he had been hiding from me. His desk drawer yielded nothing suspicious, just business cards and old receipts. His closet looked normal, filled with the clothes I had helped him pick out and the suits I had taken to the dry cleaner. But in the back of his sock drawer, tucked behind a collection of dress socks I had given him for Christmas, I found a small box I had never seen before. Inside the box were photographs, pictures of David with the woman from the cemetery, looking happy and relaxed in settings I didn't recognize, pictures of him with the teenage girl, pushing her on a swing, helping her with homework, teaching, her to ride a bike, pictures of birthday parties and Christmas mornings and family vacations that I knew nothing about. At the bottom of the box was a letter, written in David's handwriting and dated just a month before his death. My darling, Jessica, it began, and I felt my heart stop. I know I keep promising that this year will be different, that this year I'll finally have the courage to tell Sarah the truth. I see how much it hurts you to watch me go home to her every night, and I see how much it confuses Emma to have a father who can only be present for part of her life. You both deserve so much better than the half-life I've been giving you. After Sarah and my anniversary in April, I promise I will sit her down and explain everything. It won't be easy, and it will probably destroy her, but you and Emma deserve to have me completely. I love you both more than I ever thought possible, and I can't wait for us to finally be a real family. I read the letter 3 times before it fully sank in. David hadn't just been having an affair, he had been planning to leave me. He had another daughter, a child he had been raising in secret for God knows how long. He had been promising this other woman, Jessica, that he would choose her over me, that they would finally be together. And I had been completely oblivious to all of it. The betrayal cut deeper than I could have imagined. It wasn't just that David had been unfaithful. It was that he had been living an entirely separate life, one that apparently meant more to him than the life we had built together. He had been a father to another man's child, or maybe Emma was his biological daughter. He had been planning a future that didn't include me, while I had been planning a future that revolved around him. I sat on our bedroom floor, surrounded by evidence of my husband's deception, and cried harder than I had even when I first learned of his death. This wasn't just grief anymore. This was humiliation, betrayal, and the complete destruction of everything I thought I knew about my own life. I had been living a lie for years, possibly our entire marriage, and I had been too trusting and naive to see it. But as the initial shock began to wear off, something else started to take its place. Anger. Not just at David for deceiving me, but at myself for being so blind. How had I let this happen? How had I been so completely fooled by someone I thought I knew better than anyone? And more importantly, what was I going to do now? The funeral was over, David was buried, and everyone expected me to begin the process of moving on with my life. But how do you move on when you discover that the life you thought you were living never really existed? How do you grieve for a man who had been planning to abandon you? How do you rebuild when the foundation of everything you believed has been completely destroyed? As I sat there in the darkness of our bedroom, still wearing the black dress, had chosen to honor my husband's memory, I realized that my story was just beginning. David's death hadn't just ended our marriage. It had revealed the truth about what our marriage really was. And somewhere out there, Jessica and Emma were probably going through their own grief, their own sense of loss and abandonment. The difference was, they had known about me. They had been waiting for David to choose them over me, and now they would never get that choice. Tomorrow, I would have to start picking up the pieces of my shattered life. I would have to figure out how to move forward, how to rebuild my identity, how to trust anyone ever again. But tonight, I just sat with the truth of what my marriage had really been. And I began to understand that the woman I had been before David's funeral no longer existed. She had died in that cemetery, the moment I overheard Jessica talking about the family she thought she deserved to have. The morning after David's funeral, I woke up with a strange sense of purpose that surprised me. The initial shock of discovering Jessica and Emma was giving way to something else entirely, a burning need to understand the scope of David's deception. I couldn't move forward until I knew exactly what I was dealing with, and that meant I needed to learn everything about the life my husband had been living without me. I started where any modern investigation begins: the internet. Jessica Rivera wasn't hard to find once I had her name from the letter David had written. Her social media profiles were mostly private, but her LinkedIn showed she worked as a marketing coordinator for a nonprofit in Lake Oswego. The timeline made my stomach turn. She had started working in marketing 8 years ago, right around the time David began taking those frequent business trips. It wasn't a coincidence. Her Facebook profile picture showed her with Emma, both of them smiling at what looked like a high school graduation party. Emma appeared to be around 16, which meant David had been in her life since she was a small child. I studied the photo, looking for clues about their relationship. They looked comfortable together, natural, like a real family. The kind of family I had always wanted with David, but never had the chance to create. I spent hours scrolling through what little I could see of Jessica's public posts. There were photos from local events, hiking trips in the Columbia River Gorge, dinner parties with friends I didn't recognize. In several of the photos, I could see a man's hand or shoulder at the edge of the frame, someone who had been carefully cropped out. My husband. David had been living a parallel life just 20 minutes away from our house, and I had never suspected a thing. The business angle seemed like the most logical place to start my real investigation. David had always been meticulous about his work records, and if Jessica had truly been a client, there would be a paper trail. I drove to Mitchell & Associates that morning, still wearing yesterday's clothes, feeling like a stranger walking into my own husband's office. Steve Martinez, David's business partner, was already there, sorting through files and looking overwhelmed. Steve had been David's friend since college, and they had started the business together 15 years ago. If anyone would know about David's professional relationship with Jessica, it would be Steve. He looked up as I entered, his face softening with sympathy. We had already talked briefly at the funeral, but this was the first time we were alone to discuss the practical matters of David's death. "Sarah, I'm so sorry about yesterday," Steve said, standing up to give me a hug. "I know how difficult this must be for you. I've been trying to organize David's client files, but honestly, he kept a lot of his records private. I'm not sure what accounts he was handling personally." This was exactly what I needed to hear. I sat down across from Steve's desk and tried to keep my voice steady. "I'm actually here about one of his clients, Jessica Rivera. I think she was someone he worked with regularly, and I wanted to reach out to her about the funeral. She seemed really affected by David's death." Steve frowned and pulled out a thick folder labeled with client names. He flipped through it, slowly, checking each entry twice. Rivera, he murmured, running his finger down the alphabetical list. "I don't see any Jessica Rivera in our client database. Are you sure that was her name?" My heart started pounding. "She works for a nonprofit in Lake Oswego, marketing coordinator. David mentioned her several times over the years, said she was one of his most successful campaigns." "Sarah, I handle all our nonprofit accounts," Steve said gently. "We only work with 3 organizations in Lake Oswego, and none of them have anyone named Jessica Rivera on staff. I would definitely remember her if she was a client." The room felt like it was spinning. If Jessica wasn't a client, then how had David met her? And more importantly, how had he been spending time with her without Steve knowing? Steve was David's business partner and closest friend. They shared everything about the company operations. Maybe she was a potential client? I suggested weakly. Someone he was courting for business? Steve shook his head. "David always ran potential clients by me, especially nonprofit work. It's a specialized market, and we usually strategize together on those pitches. I'm sorry, Sarah, but I've never heard David mention anyone named Jessica Rivera." I thanked Steve and left the office feeling more confused than ever. If David hadn't met Jessica through work, then their entire relationship was based on an even deeper deception than I had imagined. He hadn't just been having an affair with a client. He had been maintaining a relationship that had no connection to his professional life, which meant he had been deliberately creating opportunities to see her. Back at home, I decided to take a more direct approach. I found Jessica's address through an online directory and drove to Lake Oswego that afternoon. Her house was a modest two-story colonial in a quiet neighborhood, nothing fancy but well-maintained. There was a blue Honda Civic in the driveway and a basketball hoop over the garage. It looked like the home of a single mother raising a teenager, not the kind of place where I would expect to find evidence of an affair with a successful businessman. I sat in my car across the street for almost an hour, trying to work up the courage to knock on the door. What would I say? What did I hope to accomplish? But as I was debating whether to leave, the front door opened and Emma emerged, wearing a backpack and heading toward a school bus stop at the corner. She looked so much like David that it took my breath away. The resemblance wasn't just coincidental. This girl was definitely his daughter. Jessica appeared in the doorway, watching Emma walk to the bus stop. Even from a distance, I could see that she had been crying. Her eyes were red and swollen, and she moved with the slow, careful steps of someone who was barely holding herself together. She was grieving David's death just as deeply as I was, maybe more so. At least I had been his legal wife. She had been living in the shadows, loving a man who belonged to someone else. When Jessica went back inside, I made my decision. I got out of my car and walked up to her front door, my heart pounding so hard I was sure she would be able to hear it. I rang the doorbell and waited, trying to prepare myself for whatever was about to happen. Jessica opened the door, and for a moment, we just stared at each other. She was even more beautiful in person than she had appeared at the cemetery. She had the kind of natural elegance that made designer clothes unnecessary, and her dark eyes held an intelligence that made me understand why David had been attracted to her. But there was also a wariness there, a guardedness that suggested she had been expecting this confrontation. "You're Sarah," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. "Yes, and you're Jessica." We stood there for another moment, sizing each other, up like adversaries preparing for battle. Finally, Jessica stepped aside and gestured for me to come in. Her living room was comfortable and lived in, with Emma's school photos on the mantle and books scattered on every surface. It was the kind of home that spoke of real life being lived there, not the carefully curated perfection that David and I had maintained in our house. "I wondered if you would come," Jessica said, settling into an armchair across from the couch where I sat. "David always said you were too trusting, that you would never suspect anything. But I thought maybe after the funeral, after you saw Emma and me there, you might start asking questions." Her directness caught me off guard. I had expected denial, or at least some attempt to minimize what had happened between her and David. Instead, she seemed almost relieved to finally be able to talk openly about it. "How long?" I asked. "How long were you and David together?" 8 years, Jessica replied without hesitation. "Emma was 8 when we met. She's 16 now. 8 years. That meant their relationship had started just 4 years into my marriage with David. We had still been newlyweds, still in the phase where I thought we were building something permanent and unshakable. While I was planning anniversary dinners and talking about buying a bigger house, David was falling in love with another woman. "Emma is his daughter," I said. It wasn't a question. Jessica shook her head. "Biologically, no. Emma's father died when she was 6. David came into our lives when she was 8, and he became the only father she's ever really known. He adopted her legally 3 years ago." The words hit me like a physical blow. David had adopted Emma. He had made a legal commitment to this child, had become her father in every way that mattered. While I had been struggling with infertility, mourning the children we couldn't have, David had been raising a daughter with another woman. The betrayal was so complete, so devastating, that I couldn't speak for several minutes. "He never told you about us," Jessica continued, watching my face carefully. "I know that's probably hard to believe, but it's true. David kept our lives completely separate. Emma and I never called him at home, never contacted him during times when he would be with you. We lived by his schedule, his rules, his need to keep us secret. But why? I finally managed to ask. If he loved you enough to adopt Emma, if you were together for 8 years, why didn't he just leave me? Jessica's expression softened, slightly. Because he loved you too. I know that's not what you want to hear right now, but it's true. David was torn between 2 lives, 2 families, 2 completely different versions of himself. With you, he was the successful businessman, the devoted husband, the man who had built something impressive from nothing. With us, he was just David. Emma's dad, my partner, someone who could be silly and imperfect and human. I felt tears starting to form, but I wasn't sure if they were from sadness or anger. So I was what? His public persona? His trophy wife? No, Jessica said firmly. You were his foundation. You were the life he had chosen, the commitment he had made before he met us. David felt obligated to honor that, even as his heart was pulling him in a different direction. He talked about you all the time, Sarah. He respected you, admired your strength, felt guilty every day for what he was doing to you. But not guilty enough to stop doing it. No, Jessica admitted, not guilty enough to stop. We sat in silence for a while, both of us processing the magnitude of what David had done to us. He had loved 2 women simultaneously, had created 2 families, had made promises to both of us that he couldn't possibly keep. Jessica had been waiting 8 years for him to choose her, while I had been living in complete ignorance of the choice he was supposed to make. He was going to tell you, Jessica said suddenly. After your anniversary this year, he had finally decided that he couldn't live this double life anymore. He was going to ask you for a divorce and move in with Emma and me. We had already started. Looking at houses together, planning for a future where we didn't have to hide anymore. The Hawaii trip, the vacation I had secretly planned as an anniversary surprise. David had been planning to use our anniversary as the moment to destroy our marriage, while I had been planning to celebrate it. The irony was almost too cruel to bear. What happens now? I asked. To you and Emma, I mean. David's will probably leaves everything to me. I don't imagine he made any legal provisions for you. Jessica's face hardened slightly. No, he didn't. We talked about it several times, but David always said there would be time to update his will after he told you the truth. Now Emma and I are left with nothing. No financial security, no legal claim to anything David built. 8 years of my life, 8 years of Emma's childhood, and we have nothing to show for it, except memories and grief. I could hear the bitterness in her voice, and I understood it. From Jessica's perspective, she had given the best years of her life to a man who had promised to make her his priority, but had died before following through. She had raised her daughter to see David as her father, had built her entire life around a relationship that officially didn't exist. I'm not here to fight with you, I said carefully. I just needed to understand what happened, who David really was. I feel like I've been living with a stranger for 12 years. You weren't living with a stranger, Jessica replied. You were living with one version of David, the same way Emma and I were living with another version. The David who loved you was real. The David who loved us was real too. He was just trying to be everything to everyone, and it destroyed him. As I drove home from Jessica's house, I felt more confused than ever. Part of me had expected to hate her, to see her as the villain who had stolen my husband. Instead, I found myself feeling something like sympathy for her situation. She had been as much a victim of David's deception as I had been, just in a different way. She had known about me and chosen to accept a partial relationship, while I had been completely unaware that I was sharing my husband with another family. But sympathy didn't solve the practical problems that David's death had created. Jessica was right that she and Emma had no legal claim to his estate. Everything would come to me as his widow, including the business, the house, and all of David's investments. It was a fortune that would set me up for life. Money that I had never really thought about because I had assumed David and I would grow old together and spend it gradually on the life we had planned. Now that money felt tainted, earned through years of lies and deception, David had built his business while maintaining 2 families, had accumulated wealth while making promises to 2 different women about their shared future. How could I benefit from that when Jessica and Emma would be left with nothing? That evening, I called my sister Rachel and told her everything. It felt good to finally share the burden of what I had learned, to have someone else help me process the magnitude of David's betrayal. Rachel was shocked, then angry, then protective of me in the way that only siblings can be. "Sarah, you can't blame yourself for not knowing," she said. "David was obviously very good at compartmentalizing his life. He fooled everyone, not just you." "But how did I miss it for 8 years?" I asked. "How did I never notice that he was living a double life?" "Because you trusted him," Rachel replied. "Because that's what marriages are supposed to be built on. You can't live your life assuming your spouse is lying to you about everything. That's not love. That's paranoia." Rachel was right, but it didn't make me feel better. I had prided myself on being intuitive, on understanding people and their motivations. The fact that I had been so completely deceived by my own husband made me question everything I thought I knew about myself. Over the next few days, I found myself thinking constantly about Jessica and Emma. Emma was about to start her senior year of high school, which meant college applications and expenses that Jessica would have to handle alone. Jessica worked for a nonprofit, which probably didn't pay very well, and she had been counting on David's financial support for their future. Without him, they would struggle. Meanwhile, I was inheriting a marketing firm worth over $1 million, a house that was completely paid off, and investment accounts that would allow me to live comfortably for the rest of my life. It didn't seem fair, even though legally, it was all mine. David had made his choice about where to put his money, and that choice had been to leave everything to his legal wife. But morally, didn't Jessica and Emma deserve something? I decided to call Robert Hayes, the lawyer who would be handling David's estate. Robert had been David's attorney for years, handling both business and personal legal matters. If anyone would know whether David had made any provisions for Jessica and Emma, it would be Robert. "Sarah, I'm so sorry for your loss," Robert said when I reached him at his office. "David was a good man and a valued client. I'll be happy to walk you through the estate process whenever you're ready." "Actually, I wanted to ask you about something specific," I said. "Did David ever mention a woman named Jessica Rivera to you or her daughter Emma?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "May I ask why you're asking about them?" "Because I found out about them after the funeral. I know David had a relationship with Jessica, and I know he adopted Emma. I'm wondering if he made any legal provisions for them that I should be aware of." Another pause. "Sarah, I think we should meet in person to discuss this. Can you come to my office tomorrow morning?" The tone of Robert's voice made my stomach clench. There was something he wasn't telling me, something that required a face-to-face conversation. I agreed to meet him the next day, but I spent the entire night wondering what other secrets David might have been keeping. Robert's office was in a sleek building downtown, with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the Willamette River. I had been there before for the signing of our wills and other legal documents, but this time felt different. This time, I was there to learn about parts of David's life that had been hidden from me. Robert was a kind man in his 60s who had known David since he first started his business. He had always treated me with warmth and respect, but today he seemed uncomfortable, like he was dreading our conversation. "Sarah, I want you to know that I advised David many times over the years to be honest with you about his situation," Robert began. He consulted with me several times about the legal implications of his relationships, and I always told him that maintaining two families was both ethically complicated and legally dangerous. So you knew about Jessica and Emma. I knew David had adopted a child, and that he was in a long-term relationship with the child's mother. I also knew that he had never told you about them. It put me in a very difficult position as his attorney. Robert opened a thick file folder and pulled out several documents. 3 months ago, David came to see me about updating his will. He wanted to make provisions for Jessica and Emma while still leaving the majority of his estate to you. We discussed several options, but ultimately David decided to wait until after he had spoken with you about the situation. So there's nothing for them in the current will? That's correct. Legally, you inherit everything. But David did ask me to give you this letter in the event of his death, before he had a chance to tell you the truth. Robert handed me an envelope with my name written in David's handwriting. My hands shook as I opened it, unsure if I was ready for more revelations about my husband's secret life. "My dearest Sarah," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means I've died before finding the courage to tell you about Jessica and Emma. I know this will come as a shock, and I know it will hurt you more than I can bear to imagine. I never intended for things to happen this way, but I fell in love with 2 different women and couldn't find a way to honor both relationships without destroying at least one of them." The letter went on to explain David's relationship with Jessica, his adoption of Emma, and his plans to ask me for a divorce after our anniversary. But it was the ending that made me cry. "I'm leaving everything to you because legally you are my wife, but I hope you will find it in your heart to help Jessica and Emma. They are innocent in all of this, and Emma deserves to go to college and have the future I promised to provide for her. I know I have no right to ask anything of you after what I've done, but I'm asking anyway. Please don't let my cowardice destroy their lives too." I looked up at Robert, who was watching me carefully. "What exactly is he asking me to do?" "I think he's asking you to voluntarily share the inheritance with Jessica and Emma. It's entirely up to you, Sarah. Legally, you have no obligation to them whatsoever." I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. David was asking me to give away a significant portion of the money he had left me, money that represented 12 years of marriage and partnership. He was asking me to take care of the family he had chosen over me, to clean up the mess he had made by being too cowardly to make an honest choice while he was alive. But as I sat in Robert's office, looking out at the river and thinking about Emma's college dreams and Jessica's uncertain future, I realized that David's final request might actually be an opportunity to do something that would honor the man I had thought I married, even if that man had turned out to be more complicated than I had ever imagined. The question was whether I was strong enough to be generous to the people who had been living the life I thought was mine. The decision to share David's inheritance with Jessica and Emma should have been simple, but nothing about my situation was simple anymore. I spent 3 sleepless nights weighing my options, torn between anger at David's betrayal and sympathy for the innocent people caught in the wreckage of his deception. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Emma's face at the cemetery, saw the way she had comforted Jessica with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to be strong beyond her years. I decided to visit my financial advisor, Margaret Chen, who had been helping David and me manage our investments for the past 5 years. Margaret was a no-nonsense woman in her 40s who had built her practice by giving clients honest advice, even when it wasn't what they wanted to hear. If anyone could help me understand the practical implications of sharing David's estate, it would be Margaret. Margaret's office was in the same downtown building as Robert's law firm, and the view of Mount Hood from her conference room had always made me feel optimistic about our financial future. Today, the mountain looked distant and cold, shrouded in clouds that matched my mood perfectly. "Sarah, I can't tell you how sorry I am about David," Margaret said as we settled into her conference room with coffee and a thick folder of financial documents. "He was one of my favorite clients, always so thoughtful about planning for your future together." The irony of her words wasn't lost on me. David had been planning for multiple futures, making promises to multiple women, and leaving all of us to sort out the mess after his death. I explained the situation to Margaret as objectively as I could, watching her expression change from sympathy to shock to professional concern. "From a purely financial standpoint," Margaret said when I finished, "you're inheriting approximately $8 million in assets. That includes the business, your home, David's life insurance policy, and various investment accounts. It's enough to ensure you never have to worry about money again, assuming you manage it responsibly." She pulled out a calculator and started running numbers. "If you were to split this inheritance 3 ways between yourself, Jessica, and Emma, you would each receive roughly $930,000. That's still a substantial amount, more than enough to provide security for all of you." The math made it sound so simple, but I knew the emotional calculation was far more complex. This wasn't just money we were talking about. It was the tangible result of 12 years of marriage, years during which I had supported David's business, managed our household, and sacrificed my own career dreams to build what I thought was our shared future. "What are the tax implications?" I asked. "If I decide to give Jessica and Emma part of the inheritance, how would that work legally?" Margaret consulted another document. "Gifts over a certain amount are subject to federal gift tax, but there are ways to structure it that would minimize the tax burden. You could set up a trust for Emma's education, make annual gifts that stay under the tax threshold, or simply accept the tax consequences as part of the cost of doing what you feel is right." As we talked through the various options, I found myself thinking about David's letter and his final request. He had asked me to help Jessica and Emma, but he hadn't specified how much help or what form that help should take. I could give them each a small amount and keep the majority for myself, satisfying the letter of his request while protecting my own financial future. Or I could split everything equally, treating them as true members of David's family deserving of equal inheritance. "There's something else you should consider," Margaret said gently. "If you decide to share this inheritance, you should do it quickly and make sure it's legally binding. Grief makes people act generously sometimes, but those feelings can change as time passes and the reality of the situation sets in." Her warning made sense, but it also made me realize something important about my own motivations. I wasn't considering sharing David's inheritance because I felt guilty or because I was still in shock from grief. I was considering it because it felt like the right thing to do, regardless of how I felt about David's betrayal. After leaving Margaret's office, I drove aimlessly around Portland for hours, trying to sort through my conflicted emotions. I found myself in Pioneer Courthouse Square, watching families with children playing in the fountain, couples holding hands as they walked past the food trucks, teenagers laughing with their friends outside the movie theater. All of these people seemed to be living uncomplicated lives, free from the moral dilemmas that had consumed my world since David's funeral. I called my sister Rachel from a bench near the square, needing to hear a familiar voice that could help me think through this decision rationally. "I think you're being too generous," Rachel said when I explained my conversation with Margaret. "David lied to you for 8 years, Sarah. He made you complicit in his deception without your knowledge or consent. You don't owe his secret family anything." "But Emma didn't choose any of this," I replied. "She's just a kid who lost the only father she's ever known. And Jessica, whatever her faults, spent 8 years loving a man who made her promises he couldn't keep. They're both victims of David's choices, just like I am." "That doesn't make them your responsibility," Rachel insisted. "You could give them some money, sure, but splitting everything 3 ways? That's letting David manipulate you from beyond the grave." Rachel's words stung because they contained some truth. Part of me was motivated by a desire to honor David's final wishes, to prove that I was the generous, understanding woman he had always claimed I was. But was that generosity, Or was it just another form of being controlled by David's expectations? That evening, I made a decision that surprised even me. I called Jessica and asked if I could take her and Emma to dinner. Not to discuss the inheritance, but to get to know them as people rather than just symbols of my husband's betrayal. If I was going to make a decision about their financial future, I owed it to all of us to understand who they really were. We met at a quiet restaurant in the Pearl District, a place David and I had never been together, so it wouldn't be loaded with memories of our shared history. Jessica arrived first, looking nervous and slightly defensive, as if she expected me to rescind the invitation or confront her publicly about the affair. Emma arrived a few minutes later, having taken the bus from her after-school job at a local bookstore. Up close, Emma was even more striking in her resemblance to David. She had his expressive eyes and the same habit of tilting her head slightly when she was thinking. But she also had Jessica's grace and a quiet maturity that spoke to the challenges she had faced growing up in an unconventional family situation. "This is weird," Emma said after we had ordered our food, expressing what all three of us were thinking. "I mean, you're David's wife, but you're also kind of like my stepmother, except not really because you didn't know I existed." Her directness was refreshing after days of carefully worded conversations with lawyers and financial advisors. "It is weird," I agreed. "I'm not sure what the proper etiquette is for having dinner with your dead husband's secret family." Jessica looked uncomfortable with Emma's candor. "Emma, maybe we should be more careful about how we talk about this situation." "Why?" Emma asked. "We're all dealing with the same loss, aren't we? David was important to all of us, and now he's gone. Pretending like this isn't complicated doesn't make it less complicated." As we talked over dinner, I found myself genuinely liking both Jessica and Emma. Jessica was thoughtful and articulate, clearly intelligent and well-educated despite working for a nonprofit that probably didn't pay her what she was worth. She spoke passionately about her work with homeless youth, describing programs she had developed to help teenagers find stable housing and job training. Emma was remarkable in her own right, mature beyond her 16 years but still recognizably a teenager in her enthusiasms and concerns. She talked about her plans to study environmental science in college, her volunteer work with a local river cleanup organization, and her worry about how her mother would manage financially without David's support. "He promised he would pay for my college," Emma said quietly. "Not just the tuition, but living expenses too, so Mom wouldn't have to stress about money while I was in school. Now I don't know what's going to happen. Mom makes enough for us to get by, but college costs so much." I watched Jessica's face as Emma spoke, seeing the worry and guilt there. Jessica had been counting on David's financial support, not just for herself, but for her daughter's future. Without it, Emma might have to take on massive student debt or delay her education entirely. "Tell me about David as a father," I said to Emma. "What was he like with you?" Emma's face lit up. "He was amazing. Not perfect, obviously, because of the whole situation with you, but as a dad, he was everything I could have wanted. He came to all my school plays, helped me with my math homework, taught me how to drive. When I had my first heartbreak, he brought me ice cream and listened to me cry for hours without trying to fix anything." The description of David as a devoted father was both heartwarming and heartbreaking. He had been giving Emma the kind of attention and love that I had always hoped he would give to our own children someday. The children we never had because of my fertility issues that had caused us both grief, but that we had faced together as a team. "He talked about you sometimes," Jessica said suddenly, seeming to read my thoughts. "David felt guilty about not being able to give you the family you wanted. He said it was one of the hardest parts of your marriage, knowing how much you wanted children and not being able to make that happen." Her words cut deep, but not in the way I expected. I felt a strange kind of relief knowing that David had been aware of my pain, that our struggle with infertility had affected him too. For years, I had worried that he was secretly relieved we couldn't have children, that he preferred our quiet, adult-focused life to the chaos of parenthood. He was a good father to you, I said to Emma. Whatever mistakes he made in his personal life, it sounds like he got that part right. After dinner, Jessica walked Emma to the bus stop while I sat in my car, processing everything I had learned. These weren't the calculating, manipulative people I had imagined when I first discovered their existence. They were a mother and daughter who had built their lives around David's promises, who had loved him genuinely and completely despite the limitations of their relationship. The next morning, I called Robert Hayes and asked him to draw up the legal documents necessary to split David's inheritance 3 ways. It wasn't a decision I made lightly, and it wasn't one that everyone would understand, but it felt right in a way that nothing else had since David's death. "Are you certain about this, Sarah?" Robert asked. "This is a substantial amount of money you're giving away. Once the documents are signed, you won't be able to change your mind." "I'm certain," I replied. "David asked me to help them, and this feels like the right way to do that. Besides, I'll still have enough money to live comfortably for the rest of my life. What would I do with $8 million that I couldn't do with $930,000? But even as I made this decision, I was unaware that it would soon create problems I hadn't anticipated. Word of David's secret family had begun to spread through our social circle, and not everyone was as understanding as I was trying to be. Some of David's friends and business associates were shocked by the revelation, feeling deceived by a man they had trusted and respected. Steve Martinez called me the day after I signed the inheritance documents, his voice tight with anger. "Sarah, I just heard about this Jessica woman and her daughter. I can't believe David kept this from me for 8 years. We were partners in everything, or at least I thought we were." "Steve, I know this is difficult to process," I said. "I'm still trying to understand it myself." "It's not just difficult, it's unethical," Steve continued. "David used company resources for personal expenses, took business trips that weren't really business trips, lied to clients and colleagues. This affects the reputation of our entire firm." I hadn't considered the professional implications of David's deception. Mitchell & Associates had built its reputation on trust and integrity, values that seemed compromised by the revelation that one of the founding partners had been living a double life. Clients might start questioning whether they could trust the company's advice and discretion. "What are you planning to do?" I asked. "I'm considering whether we need to rebrand the company, maybe change the name entirely. I'm also looking into whether any of David's actions could have legal consequences for the business. If he was using company money to support his other family, we could be looking at serious problems." The conversation with Steve made me realize that my decision to share the inheritance might be seen as an admission that David had done something wrong, that Jessica and Emma deserved compensation for being deceived along with me. It could potentially open up legal challenges or damage the reputation of the business that was now partially mine. But it was too late to reconsider. The documents were signed, the money was being transferred, and Jessica and Emma would soon receive their shares of David's estate. Whether that decision would ultimately help or hurt everyone involved remained to be seen. 3 days later, I received a phone call that changed everything once again. It was Amanda Foster, a lawyer I had never heard of, calling on behalf of Jessica Rivera. "Ms. Mitchell, I represent Jessica Rivera in a matter concerning your late husband's estate," Amanda said in a crisp, professional tone. "I understand you've voluntarily shared the inheritance with my client, but we have some concerns about the way the estate is being handled." My blood ran cold. "What kind of concerns?" "My client has reason to believe that your husband may have had additional assets that weren't included in the official estate inventory. We're requesting access to all of David's financial records, including business accounts and any offshore investments that may not have been disclosed." I sat down heavily, feeling like the ground was shifting beneath me again. "What additional assets?" Robert Hayes handled the estate inventory personally. Everything was accounted for. Ms. Rivera has provided me with documentation suggesting that your husband may have been hiding money from both of his families, Amanda continued. If that's the case, the inheritance you've shared may represent only a fraction of what he actually left behind. After hanging up the phone, I sat in my kitchen staring at the roses David had left me on Valentine's Day, now dried and brittle in their vase. Just when I thought I understood the scope of his deception, new layers were being revealed. Had David been hiding money from both Jessica and me? Was there truth to these accusations? Or was this Jessica's way of trying to get more than her fair share of the inheritance? I called Robert Hayes immediately, but he had already heard from Amanda Foster. Sarah, I want you to know that I stand behind the estate inventory we prepared, he said. But if there are allegations of hidden assets, we'll need to investigate them thoroughly. It could mean freezing all distributions until we can verify that everything was properly disclosed. The possibility that David had been hiding money from all of us added a new dimension to an already complex situation. If Jessica was right, then both families had been deceived, not just emotionally, but financially as well. If she was wrong, then she was trying to manipulate the legal system to get more money than I had already voluntarily given her. Either way, the decision I had made to share David's inheritance equally was about to be tested in ways I had never imagined. What had started as an attempt to do the right thing was turning into a legal battle that could destroy any hope of peace between David's two families. As I prepared for what was clearly going to be a long and complicated fight, I realized that David's death had not ended his deception. It had simply revealed new layers of it, layers that would continue to affect everyone who had loved him long after he was gone. The woman who had stood in Rose City Cemetery 2 weeks ago, mourning the loss of her devoted husband, felt like a stranger to me now. That woman had believed in the power of love and trust to overcome any obstacle. This woman, the one sitting in a kitchen full of dying roses and legal documents, was learning that sometimes love isn't enough, and trust, once broken, can never be fully repaired. But I wasn't going to let David's legacy be one of destruction and betrayal. I was going to fight for the truth, whatever that truth turned out to be. And I was going to make sure that Emma's future wasn't destroyed by the poor choices of the adults in her life. If that meant going to war with Jessica over money that might not even exist, then that's what I would do. The battle for David's true legacy was just beginning, and I intended to win. The legal challenge from Jessica's attorney hit me like a sucker punch, but it also awakened something fierce inside me that I hadn't felt since David's death. For weeks, I had been drowning in grief and confusion, trying to make sense of a marriage that had turned out to be built on lies. Now, faced with what felt like a direct attack on my generosity, I found myself getting angry for the first time since this nightmare began. I hired my own attorney, Lisa Thompson, a family law specialist who came highly recommended by Robert Hayes. Lisa was a small woman with steel gray hair and the kind of sharp intelligence that made opposing lawyers nervous. When I explained the situation to her, she listened without judgment, taking notes on a yellow legal pad and asking pointed questions about David's business practices and financial habits. The first thing we need to understand, Lisa said, is whether Jessica Rivera's claims have any merit. If your husband was hiding assets, we need to find them before she does. If he wasn't, we need to prove that definitively so we can put this matter to rest. Lisa recommended hiring a forensic accountant, someone who specialized in uncovering hidden financial assets. Within days, I found myself working with Mike Chen, a soft-spoken man in his 30s who approached financial investigations like puzzles that needed solving. Mike had worked on high-profile divorce cases and corporate fraud investigations, and he assured me that if David had been hiding money, he would find it. People think they're clever about hiding assets, Mike explained as we sat in David's home office, surrounded by boxes of financial documents. They open accounts in different states, use business entities to mask personal expenses, or transfer money to family members temporarily. But money always leaves a trail, and that trail can be followed if you know what to look for. Mike's investigation began with David's known accounts and worked outward, following every transaction, every wire transfer, every unusual expense that couldn't be easily explained. He requested records from banks we had never done business with, credit card companies I had never heard of, and investment firms that weren't on our regular statements. Meanwhile, I was dealing with the emotional fallout of Jessica's legal challenge. The generous impulse that had led me to share David's inheritance now felt naive and potentially self-destructive. I had tried to do the right thing, to honor David's final wishes and help the family he had loved in secret, and in return, I was being accused of withholding assets I didn't even know existed. Steve Martinez was furious when he learned about the forensic investigation. "This is exactly what I was worried about," he said during an emergency meeting at the office. "Now we have investigators going through our business records, looking for evidence of financial impropriety. Even if they don't find anything, the mere fact that we're being investigated could destroy our reputation." "Steve, I understand your concerns," I replied, "but we don't have a choice. If Jessica's lawyer is right and David was hiding money, we need to know about it. If she's wrong, we need to prove it so decisively that she can't continue making these accusations." The investigation was more invasive than I had expected. Mike needed access to David's computer, his phone records, his travel receipts, and even our joint tax returns going back 10 years. He interviewed our accountant, our investment advisor, and several of David's longtime clients. Every aspect of our financial life was scrutinized and analyzed for signs of deception. What Mike found was both surprising and disturbing. David had indeed been hiding money, but not in the way Jessica's lawyer had suggested. Instead of secret offshore accounts or hidden business assets, David had been systematically overpaying his taxes for years, building up massive credits with the IRS that could be claimed as refunds. He had also been making contributions to retirement, accounts under false business entities, accounts that technically belonged to him but were legally separate from his personal estate. "Your husband was very sophisticated about this," Mike explained as he showed me spreadsheets detailing David's financial maneuvering. "He wasn't hiding money from the government or from business partners. He was hiding it from both of his families. These accounts and credits represent approximately $2 million that wasn't included in the original estate inventory." The discovery was staggering. David hadn't just been living a double life emotionally. He had been preparing financially for a future that none of us knew about. The hidden money wasn't meant for Jessica and Emma, and it wasn't meant for me. It was David's escape fund, money he could access if he ever decided to abandon both families and start fresh somewhere else. "This changes everything," Lisa said when Mike presented his findings. "Legally, these assets should be included in the estate and distributed according to David's will. Since his will left everything to you, this additional money belongs to you entirely." But the moral implications were more complicated than the legal ones. Jessica's lawyer had been right that David was hiding assets. Even if her suspicions about offshore accounts had been wrong, did that mean Jessica and Emma were entitled to a share of this newly discovered money? Or did David's deception run so deep that he had been planning to betray both families, making all of us victims of his ultimate selfishness? I decided to call Jessica directly rather than letting our lawyers handle the communication. We met at a coffee shop in downtown Portland, neutral territory where we could speak honestly without the formal constraints of legal proceedings. "You were right," I told her as we sat across from each other with untouched lattes growing cold between us. David was hiding money. About $2 million in various accounts and tax credits that weren't part of the original estate. Jessica's face showed a mixture of vindication and concern. I knew it. David was always secretive about money, always telling me not to worry about finances because he had everything under control. But sometimes I would see bank statements or investment documents that didn't match what he told me about our financial situation. "But here's the thing," I continued. This wasn't money he was saving for you and Emma. It wasn't money he was hiding from me to give to you. This was money he was keeping secret from all of us. My accountant thinks David was planning for a future that didn't include either family. The color drained from Jessica's face. What do you mean? I pulled out a folder containing some of Mike's findings. David had been researching expatriation, looking into what it would take to renounce his American citizenship and move to a country without extradition treaties. He had downloaded information about living costs in places like Costa Rica and Thailand. He was planning an exit strategy that would have left all of us behind. Jessica stared at the documents in shock. That can't be right. David loved Emma. He would never have abandoned her. Maybe not, I said gently. But the evidence suggests he was at least considering it as an option. The hidden money, the research into living abroad, the complete separation of these assets from both of his known lives. It looks like David was keeping a third option open, one that didn't require him to choose between families because it involved leaving both families behind. We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us processing the implications of what David had been planning. The man we had both loved, the man we had both trusted with our futures, had been preparing to disappear entirely rather than face the consequences of his deception. What happens now? Jessica asked finally. To the money, I mean. Legally, it all comes to me as David's widow, I replied. But morally, I'm not sure what the right thing to do is anymore. David was planning to betray all of us. Does that change how we should handle his estate? Jessica's response surprised me. I think it does. If David was planning to abandon Emma, then maybe he doesn't deserve to have his final wishes respected. Maybe we should make our own decisions about what's fair, without worrying about what he would have wanted. Her words resonated with something I had been feeling but hadn't been able to articulate. David's betrayal was so complete, so devastating, that perhaps I owed him nothing. Not respect for his memory, not compliance with his final requests, not protection of his reputation. Maybe it was time to stop thinking about what David would have wanted and start thinking about what was best for the people he had left behind. I have an idea, I said. What if we use the hidden money to set up a trust fund for Emma's education and future? Not because David wanted us to, but because she deserves to have opportunities despite the mistakes her father figure made. Jessica's eyes filled with tears. You would do that? Even after everything that's happened? Emma didn't choose any of this, I replied. She's 17 years old, and she just lost the only father she's ever known. The fact that he was planning to possibly abandon her makes it even more important that we protect her future. But even as we were making plans to secure Emma's future, new complications were emerging. Amanda Foster, Jessica's lawyer, was not satisfied with the discovery of the hidden assets. She was demanding a complete audit of Mitchell and Associates, claiming that David might have been using business funds to support his secret planning for expatriation. This is getting out of hand, Steve told me during another tense meeting at the office. Amanda Foster is basically accusing David of embezzling from his own company to fund a plan to flee the country. Even if the accusations are false, the investigation process is destroying our client relationships. Steve was right. Word of the investigation had spread through Portland's business community, and several longtime clients had already terminated their contracts with Mitchell and Associates. The marketing firm that David had spent 15 years building was collapsing under the weight of revelations about his personal life. I'm sorry, Sarah, Steve continued, but I think I need to buy out your share of the business and rebrand. Completely. I can't save the company while it's still associated with David's name in this scandal. The offer Steve made for my share of the business was fair, given the circumstances, but it represented another loss in a year that had already taken everything I thought I knew about my life. The company David and I had built together would survive, but it would survive without any trace of the Mitchell name or the partnership that had once seemed unbreakable. As I signed the documents transferring my ownership stake to Steve, I felt a strange sense of relief. The business had been tainted by David's deception, and perhaps it was better to let it go entirely rather than trying to salvage something that would always be associated with lies and betrayal. Meanwhile, Mike Chen's investigation had expanded beyond David's hidden assets to include a detailed analysis of his travel patterns and expenses over the past 8 years. What he found painted an even more disturbing picture of David's double life. "Your husband wasn't just supporting 2 families," Mike explained as he showed me hotel receipts and airline tickets I had never seen before. "He was living 3 completely separate lives. The life with you, the life with Jessica and Emma, and a 3rd life that involved regular trips to Southeast Asia and Central America." The receipts showed that David had been taking solo trips to Thailand, Costa Rica, and Belize several times a year. Trips that weren't on any calendar I had access to and weren't accounted for in our personal or business travel budgets. He had been using the hidden money to fund these trips, apparently scouting locations where he could potentially relocate if he decided to abandon his American life entirely. "There's more," Mike continued. David had been in contact with immigration, lawyers in 3 different countries, asking about residency requirements and investment visas. He had also been researching how to transfer large sums of money internationally without triggering reporting requirements. The scope of David's planning was breathtaking in its thoroughness and chilling in its implications. He hadn't just been having an affair or even maintaining 2 families. He had been preparing for the possibility of disappearing entirely, of starting over in a country where neither Jessica nor I would ever be able to find him. "How long was he planning this?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the why. Answer. Mike consulted his timeline. "Based on the documentation I found, David started researching expatriation options about 2 years ago. The hidden accounts were opened over the past 5 years, but the international travel and legal consultations are more recent. 2 years ago, David and I had been planning our 10-year anniversary trip to Europe. We had spent hours looking at travel websites, booking restaurants, and discussing all the places we wanted to see together. While I was dreaming about our romantic getaway, David was apparently planning his escape route. The betrayal was so complete, so devastating, that I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew about human nature. How could someone live with such calculated deception for so long? How could David look me in the eyes every morning, tell me he loved me, and spend his days planning for a future that involved abandoning me entirely? But perhaps the most disturbing revelation came when Mike discovered that David had been using a false identity for some of his international travel. He had obtained a 2nd passport using his middle name and his mother's maiden name, technically legal, but clearly intended to create separation between his various identities. "David Michael Hayes," Mike read from the passport application. He used his stepfather's surname instead of Mitchell. This passport was used for at least 6 trips over the past 2 years, always to countries he had been researching for potential relocation. The false identity meant that David's planning had gone beyond mere research. He had been actively preparing to assume a new identity in a new country, leaving behind not just his family's, but his entire legal existence in the United States. As I absorbed this final revelation, I realized that the man I had mourned, the man I had loved for 12 years, had never really existed at all. David Mitchell had been a character he played, a role he performed while his true self remained hidden behind layers of deception and contingency plans. The grief I had been carrying since his death began to transform into something else entirely. I wasn't just mourning the loss of my husband anymore. I was mourning the loss of my own ability to trust, my faith in the possibility of authentic human connection, and my belief that love could conquer the challenges that life presented. But I was also discovering something unexpected: my own strength. The woman who had stood in that cemetery 3 weeks ago, devastated by the loss of her devoted husband, was gone forever. In her place was someone harder, more skeptical, but Also, more independent and self-reliant than I had ever been before. David's deception had been designed to give him maximum flexibility and minimum accountability. He had wanted to keep all his options open, to never have to make a definitive choice about which life he wanted to live. But his death had forced a reckoning that he had spent years trying to avoid. And that reckoning was revealing truths that would have destroyed him if he had lived to face them. As I prepared for what I knew would be the final confrontation with Jessica and her lawyer, I realized that David's legacy wasn't going to be the successful business he had built or the families he had loved. His legacy was going to be the lesson that some betrayals are so complete, so devastating, that they can never be forgiven or forgotten. But perhaps that was a lesson worth learning, even if the cost of learning it had been everything I thought I knew about love, trust, and the possibility of building a life with another person. The final meeting with Jessica and Amanda Foster took place in Robert Hayes' conference room on a gray Thursday morning in April, exactly 2 months after David's death. The room felt smaller than I remembered, crowded with legal documents, financial statements, and the weight of revelations that had fundamentally changed how all of us understood the man we were fighting over. Amanda Foster was a sharp-dressed woman in her 50s who carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to winning difficult cases. She had reviewed all of Mike Chen's findings, and I could see from her expression that she was struggling to reconcile the evidence with her client's interests. Jessica sat beside her lawyer, looking pale and exhausted, as if the past weeks of investigation had drained all the fight out of her. "Before we begin," Amanda said, "I want to state for the record that my client had no knowledge of David Mitchell's expatriation planning or his use of false documentation for international travel. Jessica Rivera believed she was in a committed, long-term relationship with a man who intended to formalize their family unit through marriage." Lisa Thompson, my attorney, nodded acknowledgement but didn't respond directly. We had all agreed that this meeting would focus on resolution rather than assigning blame for David's deception. The evidence spoke for itself, and everyone in the room understood the implications. "The question before us today," Robert Hayes said, acting as mediator, "is how to distribute the newly discovered assets in a way that serves the best interests of all parties, particularly Emma Rivera, who is the only true innocent in this situation." I had spent the previous night thinking about what I wanted to say, how I wanted this chapter of my life to end. The woman who had discovered David's betrayal at his funeral had been focused on understanding what had happened and why. This woman, the one sitting in a lawyer's office 2 months later, was focused on building a future that honored truth rather than the comfortable lies I had been living with for 12 years. "I've made a decision," I said, looking directly at Jessica rather than addressing the lawyers. The hidden assets that David accumulated, the $2 million he was apparently planning to use for his escape from all of us, should be used to create a trust fund for Emma's education and early adult life. Not because David would have wanted that, but because Emma deserves to have opportunities despite the choices made by the adults in her life. Jessica's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't speak immediately. Amanda Foster leaned forward, clearly preparing to negotiate the terms of such an arrangement, but Jessica held up her hand to stop her. "Before we talk about money," Jessica said quietly, "I need to apologize to you, Sarah. When I hired Amanda and demanded this investigation, I thought David had been hiding assets that belonged to Emma and me. I thought you were keeping money. That should have been ours. I never imagined that David was planning to abandon all of us." Her words carried a weight that went beyond mere apology. Jessica was acknowledging what we had both learned through this painful process, that David's betrayal was far more extensive than either of us had realized, and that we had both been victims of his ultimate selfishness. "I need to apologize, too," I replied. "When I first found out about you and Emma, I blamed you for destroying my marriage. It took me weeks to understand that my marriage was already destroyed by David's choices. You didn't seduce my husband away from me. He created a separate life with you, while lying to both of us about his intentions. The conversation that followed was unlike anything I could have imagined when this nightmare began. Instead of fighting over David's legacy, Jessica and I found ourselves working together to protect Emma from the fallout of his deception. We discussed how to structure the trust fund, what conditions should be placed on Emma's access to the money, and how to ensure that she could attend college without being burdened by the financial uncertainty that David's death had created. I want Emma to be able to make choices based on her interests and abilities, not based on what she can afford, I said. David robbed her of the security of having a father who was completely committed to her future. The least we can do is make sure his selfishness doesn't limit her opportunities. Amanda Foster drew up the legal documents creating the trust fund while we waited. The arrangement was more generous than anything Jessica could have won in court. Even if she had been able to prove that the hidden assets should be shared equally, Emma would receive the full $2 million, structured to provide her with college tuition, living expenses, and a substantial sum for starting her adult life after graduation. But the trust fund was only part of what needed to be resolved. There was still the question of how to handle David's reputation and the impact his deception would have on everyone who had known and trusted him. Steve Martinez had already begun the process of rebranding Mitchell & Associates, but David's clients, friends, and extended family were still struggling to understand how they had been so completely fooled by someone they thought they knew. "I've been thinking about something," Jessica said as we finished signing the trust documents. David spent so much energy maintaining his lies, keeping all of us separated and unaware of each other. What if we did the opposite? What if we told the truth, publicly and completely, so that other people could learn from what happened to us? The idea was both terrifying and appealing. For months, I had been dreading the possibility that David's deception would become public knowledge, that I would be seen as the naive wife who had been too trusting to notice her husband's double life. But Jessica was suggesting that we take control of the narrative, that we use our experience to help other people recognize the warning signs of elaborate deception. "What did you have in mind?" I asked. "A foundation," Jessica replied. "Something that provides resources for people who discover they've been living with partners who were maintaining secret lives. Support groups, counseling services, legal assistance for sorting out complicated financial situations. We could turn our worst experience into something that helps other people." The more we talked about it, the more the idea made sense. David's deception had been so sophisticated, so carefully planned, that it seemed likely other people were living through similar situations without knowing it. If we could create resources to help them recognize the signs and cope with the aftermath, then maybe David's betrayal could ultimately serve a positive purpose. Lisa Thompson helped us research the legal requirements for establishing a nonprofit organization. We would need a board of directors, a mission statement, and a plan for raising funds beyond the money from David's hidden assets. But the framework was manageable, and both Jessica and I felt energized by the possibility of channeling our pain into something constructive. "What would we call it?" Jessica asked. I thought about the cemetery where this all began, about the moment when I overheard Jessica talking about David's promises and realized my entire life had been built on lies. "The Truth Foundation," I suggested, for people discovering truth in the aftermath of deception. Over the following weeks, we worked together to establish the foundation and begin developing its programs. Emma, who was initially skeptical about her mother and me working together, became one of our strongest supporters when she understood what we were trying to accomplish. "David lied to all of us," she said during one of our planning meetings. "But maybe we can make sure other kids don't have to go through what I went through, wondering if their parent really loves them or if they're just playing a role." Emma's insight was profound. David's deception hadn't just affected Jessica and me as romantic partners. It had affected Emma as a daughter who had never been able to count on having her father's complete attention and commitment. She had grown up knowing that she was sharing David with another family, but she hadn't known that he was also planning for a future that might not include her at all. The First Truth Foundation support group met in the community room at the Portland Public Library 6 months after David's death. 12 people attended that initial meeting, men and women who had discovered various forms of deception in their relationships. Some had learned about secret affairs, others about hidden addictions or financial fraud. A few had experienced the kind of elaborate double life that David had maintained. "The hardest part," said Maria, a woman whose husband had been maintaining a second family in another state, "is feeling like you were stupid for not knowing. Like you should have seen the signs, should have asked better questions, should have been more suspicious." Her words resonated with everyone in the room, including me. The shame of being deceived was almost as painful as the deception itself. The sense that we should have been smarter, more observant, less trusting. But listening to other people's stories, I began to understand that sophisticated deception often succeeds precisely because it exploits our capacity for trust and love. "David was a master manipulator," I said during that first meeting. "He compartmentalized his life so completely that even people who knew him well in one context had no idea what he was doing in other contexts. We weren't stupid for trusting him. We were human." The foundation grew quickly, developing resources that I wished had been available to me during those first terrible weeks after discovering David's betrayal. We created counseling services specifically designed for people dealing with relationship deception, legal assistance for untangling complicated financial situations, and support groups for children and teenagers whose families had been affected by parental dishonesty. Jessica and I worked well together, perhaps because we understood each other's pain in a way that no one else could. We had both loved the same man, had both been betrayed by him in different but equally devastating ways, and had both learned to rebuild our lives from the wreckage of his deception. "Do you ever miss him?" Jessica asked me one evening as we worked late in the foundation's office, preparing materials for a new support group. The question surprised me, not because I hadn't thought about it, but because the answer was so complicated. "I miss the man I thought he was," I said finally. "I miss the marriage I thought I had, the future I thought we were building together. But I don't miss David, because I'm not sure the David I loved ever really existed." Jessica nodded thoughtfully. "I feel the same way. I loved the father Emma thought she had, the partner I believed David was becoming. But that person was just a character he played when he was with us. The real David was someone who could look at a 16-year-old girl who called him dad and planned to disappear from her life without warning. Emma, now a college freshman studying environmental science at Portland State University, had become an articulate advocate for the foundation's work with young people. She spoke at conferences and wrote blog posts about growing up in a family built on deception, about learning to trust again after discovering that the most important adult in your life had been lying about fundamental aspects of his identity. "The foundation saved my life," she wrote in one particularly powerful post. "Not because it gave me money for college, though that was incredibly generous, but because it helped me understand that my father's lies weren't about me. They weren't evidence that I wasn't worth loving or that families can't be trusted. They were evidence that one person made selfish choices that hurt the people who cared about him." As the foundation's work expanded, we began receiving requests for consultation from other communities dealing with similar situations. Apparently, elaborate relationship deception was more common than any of us had realized, and there were few resources available to help people cope with the discovery that their lives had been built on lies. We developed workshops for mental health professionals, teaching them how to recognize and treat the specific trauma that comes from discovering intimate deception. We created legal guides for people trying to sort out assets that had been hidden or misrepresented. Most importantly, we built a community of people who understood that recovery from betrayal was possible, even when that betrayal was as complete and devastating as what David had done to his families. 2 years after David's death, I stood in The same cemetery where this journey had begun, but this time I wasn't there to mourn. I was there to visit the grave of a man whose deception had ultimately led to something positive, something that was helping other people avoid or recover from similar pain. The headstone read simply, David Mitchell, 1978, 2023, beloved husband and father. We had debated whether to change the inscription after learning the truth about his planning and false identity, but ultimately decided that the words reflected what he had been to us, even if they didn't reflect who he truly was. I forgive you, I said quietly, placing fresh flowers on the grave. Not because what you did was forgivable, but because carrying anger toward a dead man was destroying my ability to build a life worth living. The forgiveness wasn't complete or unconditional. I would never understand how David could have planned to abandon Emma, how he could have looked me in the eyes every morning while planning for a future that didn't include me. But I had learned that forgiveness could be a choice rather than a feeling, a decision to release resentment in service of personal healing rather than an emotional absolution of the person who had caused harm. Jessica joined me at the cemetery, bringing Emma, who was home from college for the weekend. We stood together in front of David's grave, 3 women whose lives had been forever changed by his choices, but who had found a way to build something meaningful from the wreckage he had left behind. Do you think he would be proud of what we've built? Emma asked, looking at the foundation brochure we had brought to show him. I think he would be ashamed, I replied honestly. Not of what we've accomplished, but of the fact that his selfishness made it necessary. David wanted to avoid consequences, to keep all his options open without having to face the pain he was causing. The foundation exists because he failed to take responsibility for his choices while he was alive. As we walked back to our cars, I reflected on how much had changed since that terrible day when I first learned about Jessica and Emma. The woman, who had stood in this cemetery 2 years ago, devastated by the discovery of her husband's betrayal, had been focused on understanding what had happened and why. This woman, walking between David's secret family and his memorial, was focused on the future rather than the past. The Truth Foundation had helped hundreds of people navigate the aftermath of intimate deception. Emma was thriving in college, studying environmental science and planning a career dedicated to protecting the natural world that her adoptive father had been willing to abandon, along with everything else in his American life. Jessica had returned to school herself, earning a master's degree in social work so she could better serve the foundation's clients. And I had learned something valuable about resilience, about the possibility of rebuilding identity and purpose after the complete destruction of everything you thought you knew about your life. David's betrayal had been designed to preserve his freedom at the cost of everyone else's security. But in the end, his deception had freed us to become people we never could have been while living within the constraints of his lies. The Foundation's motto, printed on every brochure and displayed prominently in our office, came from something Emma had said during one of our early planning meetings. Truth is the foundation of everything worth building. It was a lesson we had learned the hard way through the painful discovery that lives built on deception will ultimately collapse under the weight of their own contradictions. But it was also a promise we made to ourselves and to everyone who sought our help, that it was possible to rebuild after betrayal, to create something authentic and meaningful from the ruins of shattered trust, and to transform the worst experiences of human deception into resources for healing and hope. David Mitchell had spent the last years of his life planning for a future that involved abandoning everyone who loved him. In death, his deception had inadvertently created something he never could have imagined: a lasting legacy of truth, healing, and genuine human connection built by the people he had been prepared to betray. As I drove home from the cemetery, I realized that this was the end of one story and the beginning of another. The story of David's betrayal was finished, resolved not through revenge or legal victory, but through the choice to transform pain into purpose. The story of what came next, of the lives we would build with full knowledge of how quickly trust could be shattered and how carefully it needed to be rebuilt, was just beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.